Good evening, my friends. Today I'm talking about the types of seam allowance. Seam allowance is the extra fabric added beyond the stitching line to allow for proper seam construction, durability, and adjustments. Different types of seam allowances serve various purposes in sewing and garment making. Here are some common types along with their procedures. Types of seam allowance and their procedures. 1. The plain seam allowance. For a seam, place fabric pieces right sides together. Stitch along the marked seam line. Trim excess seam allowance if necessary. Press the seam open or to one side. 2. Double-stitched seam allowance. For a seam, stitch along the seam line. Stitch a second row parallel to the first for reinforcement. Trim excess seam allowance. Press the seam flat or open. 3. French seam allowance for delicate fabrics. Procedure. Place fabric wrong sides together and stitch with a small seam allowance, EGM, 1/4 inch. Trim the seam to about 1/8 inch. Fold fabric along the seam so the right sides are together. Stitch again with a slightly wider seam allowance to encase raw edges. Press the seam to one side. 4. Flat felled seam allowance for strong, durable seams. Procedure. Place fabric wrong sides together and sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim one side of the seam allowance to 1/4 inch. Fold the longer side over the trimmed edge and tuck it under. Top stitch close to the folded edge to secure. Press the seam flat. 5. Bound seam allowance for finishing raw edges. Stitch the seam with the required allowance. Trim the edges if necessary. Encase the raw edges with bias tape or fabric binding. Stitch the binding in place for a clean finish. 6. Overlocked/serger seam allowance for stretch fabrics or preventing fraying. Procedure. Stitch the seam as needed. Use an overlocked/serger machine to finish the raw edges. Trim excess fabric if necessary. Press the seam flat or to one side. 7. Pinked seam allowance for lightweight fabrics. Or sew the seam as usual. Use pinking shears to trim the seam allowance. Press the seam open or to one side. 8. Lapped seam allowance, common in denim or sportswear. Overlap one fabric piece over another with the required allowance. Stitch along the overlapped edge. Use top stitching to secure the seam. Press the seam flat. Each type of seam allowance is used based on the fabric type, garment design, and functional requirement. Let me know if you need details on a specific seam technique.